Today, we're taking a look at the record-setting Fairey Long-Range monoplane. It was the product of a time when great national prestige was attached to the field of aviation, or rather, the field of record-breaking aviation. The country whose aircraft could fly the fastest, furthest, and highest, all whilst burning the least amount of fuel, were obviously the best. And there was a constant battle of the numbers throughout the 1920s and 1930s as countries and manufacturers vied to make the best aircraft possible. Now, there aren't many photos of the Fairey available, so I'm going to have to reuse them a few times to keep this from appearing too much like a glorified slideshow, so apologies in advance for that. Now, the story of the long-range monoplane began with Air Ministry Specification 33/27. This was drawn up in response to interest from Fairey in developing a long-range aircraft to try and complete a non-stop flight to India. Initially, Fairey test pilot Norman Macmillan had proposed using the prototype Fairey Fox for the flight, but as the type was still going through its development as a military aircraft, the proposal was denied, and the Air Ministry instead drew up the specification for a specific aircraft. The specification was a fairly broad one, so as to not limit Fairey too much in exploring design proposals. It had some basic requirements, such as positive stability in all axes, which is usually preferable, and proposing the use of a Napier Lion engine, which was fairly common, though the use of a Rolls-Royce F engine was also considered later. The gross weight was to be about 16,000 pounds, and the fuel capacity more than 1,000 gallons, giving the aircraft a theoretical range in the order of 5,000 miles. Designed by Fairey's chief engineer, Major T.M. Barlow, the aircraft was ostensibly listed as a postal aircraft, to placate various members of Parliament and the Treasury, who frowned upon the vanity of chasing after records in times of growing economic strife. Various design layouts were explored, including those for a biplane, and for both high-wing and low-wing monoplanes as well. The high-wing cantilever arrangement was eventually chosen following favourable wind tunnel tests at Farnborough, and when consideration was given to the need for the fuel to be gravity-fed, with the main tanks being in the wing, the high-wing layout became the obvious choice. By May 1928, construction was well underway at the factory at Hayes. The wing had wooden spars, and it featured a new type of steel pyramid bracing. The object of this bracing was to transmit torsion loads and to compel each spar to carry an appreciable proportion of the total load, irrespective of the position of the centre of pressure. This was considered especially important, as during a long-range flight, the aircraft would encounter a large variety of different weather conditions, and its structure had to manage all of them with equal effectiveness. For a single-engine aircraft, the wingspan was on the large side, coming in at 82 feet, but this was necessary to produce the amount of lift required to keep it efficient enough for just one engine. Despite being quite thick, with an aspect ratio of 7.5, the wind tunnel tests estimated that a maximum lift-drag ratio of 22:1 would be attained, which, when combined with an appreciable fuel load, would be more than enough to meet the range requirement. Though the wings were efficient in the air, the aircraft was expected to have a fairly lengthy takeoff run. To address this, and to make it as stable as possible on said takeoff run, the long-range monoplane had an unusually wide fixed undercarriage. There was tankage for a total of 1,043 gallons, and the fuel was fed by gravity to a collector tank in the fuselage. From this, it was fed by mechanical pump to the engine, and in case of failure, there was an additional pump driven by a windmill, which could be extended into the slipstream. The engine itself was not decided upon until October 1928, when the aircraft was almost complete, and it was decided to power the Postal, as it was now called, with the 570 horsepower Napier Lion 11A. A 12-cylinder, broad-arrow, liquid-cooled engine with a slightly raised compression. One of the special features of this power plant installation was the oil system. 2 oil filters, which could be reached from the cockpit, were installed in parallel circuits, so that one could be removed if necessary for cleaning while leaving the other in action. The Postal was to have a crew of 2, a pilot and a navigator, who could also act as a reserve pilot if needed. Accommodation for 40-hour-plus flights was provided with special, extra comfy upholstery in the cockpit, and a folding bed in a cabin directly behind. The poster was flown for the first time on the 14th of November 1928. Curiously, it was not a Fairey test pilot who would take it up for the inaugural flight, but a pair of RAF servicemen, Squadron Leader A.G. Jones-Williams and Flight Lieutenant F.V. Major. Though Fairey had produced the aircraft, the Air Ministry insisted that the record attempt flight was to be made by RAF personnel, and because of this, they might as well get to fly it from the get-go. After preliminary trials, in which Fairey pilots also got a chance to test the aircraft that their company had developed, it was handed over to the RAF and sent to Cranwell for more extensive evaluations. Among these was partially loaded takeoff tests and a 24-hour endurance trial, after which, and providing all was well, a new engine would be installed for long-distance record attempts. Things, however, did not go quite according to plan. The engine had to be changed after just the second test flight, which lasted less than 10 minutes, due to problems with high fuel consumption and engine vibrations, neither of which would be ideal on a long-distance flight over incredibly remote regions. The vibration caused what was described at the time as carburetor dither, which in turn caused a varying of the fuel mixture and irregular fuel consumption. In January 1929, there were 2 more engine changes in an attempt to remedy this, and other seemingly obstinate fuel efficiency problems, during which it was discovered that the ignition advance decrease control had been reversed during an earlier installation. Although it was said at the time that this reversal made little difference, the consumption curves apparently looked much better after the error had been corrected. Owing to these delays, the 24-hour endurance flight, planned for December, was not completed until the 22nd and 23rd of March 1929. The flight was reasonably successful, though exhaust fumes entered the cabin, causing discomfort and no small amount of nausea, and one valve in the Lion engine burned and caused a drop in RPMs of about 200, but an estimated distance of 950 miles was covered, using a little over 430 gallons of fuel and 15 gallons of oil. This test showed that with a full fuel load, a total distance of over 5,000 miles was still possible. This was reassuring, as the current long-distance record now sat at 4,466 miles. The 3-month delay had meant a change in plans for the proposed route. Initially, the plan had been to fly from Cranwell to Cape Town. However, the wind and weather no longer served for such a journey, and an alternative route from Cranwell to Bangalore was selected instead. Additionally, the crew complement for the aircraft was also changed. Flight Lieutenant Major was considered medically and temperamentally unstable, and he was replaced by Flight Lieutenant Jenkins. Major had considerably more experience than Jenkins in the art of navigation, and for reasons that will eventually become apparent, this decision to replace him would later come under painful scrutiny. Despite the record-attempting flight being just a few weeks away, the aircraft had yet to complete the team's idea of a fully loaded takeoff. On the first day of full load tests, the 30th of March, the wind had blown in the wrong direction, so the test had to be abandoned. On the next day, it was attempted again, but the wind had not changed, and the takeoff run was done at a slight incline, rather than the ideal downward slope that had been chosen, and after failing to exceed 75 miles an hour on the ground, the run was abandoned. Just 4 days before the planned flight to India, the aircraft's first full-load takeoff was finally completed, and everyone was confident that, providing it took off into the wind, with about a mile of runway in front of it, the long-range monoplane would be fine. Jones-Williams and Jenkins took off for their record attempt on the 24th of April. Accompanied by a Supermarine Southampton as far as the coast of Holland, they were over Istanbul after 16.5 hours of flight time, and 22 hours later they were flying over Karachi. At this point, they realized there was only enough fuel for 6 more hours of flight time, and that they still needed to cover an additional 650 miles to break the record. This could have been done, but it would have necessitated flying until the tanks were empty, and then attempting a landing in the dark, which, given the state of the hastily prepared landing field, did not seem like a fun option. They turned back and landed at Karachi with 83 gallons of fuel left. Though they had not beaten the record of 4,466 miles, they had completed the first non-stop flight to India. Early in June, the decision was made to try for the record again in autumn, when the winds were calmer, and the destination could also once again be switched back to South Africa. The existing record still stood at 4,466 miles, and this could easily be beaten by a non-stop flight to Walvis Bay, which would cover a distance of 5,340 miles. Jones, Williams, and Jenkins were again chosen to make the flight, though there were concerns raised that Flight Lieutenant Major should have taken Jenkins' place as a dedicated navigator. This was for two reasons: better navigation reduced flight corrections, and thus wasted fuel, and it also provided an extra level of safety for a flight that would cover the entire length of the African continent. However, Jenkins remained on the crew. Before the flight was attempted, the decision was made to modify and test the monoplane further, following an extensive report on the flight to India. Complaints from Jones-Williams about constant rudder handling, and a tendency for the engines to run a bit hot, led to the enlarging of the radiator, as well as some adjustments to the rudder and balancer to improve feet-off flying. Unfortunately, these changes delayed the flight until December 1929. This not only resulted in a deterioration of the weather, but there was now added pressure, as the record-breaking distance now needed was 4,975 miles, as the old record had been broken in late September by a flight from Paris to Manchuria. Jones, Williams, and Jenkins took off for their new attempt on the 16th of December 1929, but tragically they would never reach their destination. The attempt ended in disaster when the aircraft struck high ground south of Tunis at around 6:45 in the evening, with both pilots being killed. The point of impact, about 30 miles south of Tunis, was at a height of 2,300 feet, and it was never fully established why the aircraft had descended. The navigation log sheet and barographs mostly survived the crash unscathed. As it crossed the coast of Sardinia, the aircraft was maintaining altitude at 5,000 feet, but a short while later, the navigation log said that the aircraft was still in very thick clouds at 5,000 feet, yet the barographs showed that the aircraft was in fact well below 3,000 feet and descending gradually. The cause of the crash could have been a deliberate descent in an attempt to get below the poor weather, but another likely cause could have been the failure of the altimeter. Either way, many felt that, had Flight Lieutenant Major been on the flight as a dedicated navigator, one with many years' experience, things may have been different, and there was many a guilty conscience for some time after this. Later on, in 1931, after the investigation had concluded, and after the worst of the financial shock of the 1929 crash had abated, the RAF felt they could justify another attempt at the record. Despite the accident, the Fairey monoplane had performed well, and a second, slightly improved version was designed and built to a new specification, which was 14/30. This second long-range monoplane had a somewhat different fuel system, a redesigned rudder balancer, new landing wheel fairings, a more carefully faired undercarriage to reduce drag, and an early autopilot system. This system was developed by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. It operated in two axes for roll and directional control, and a windmill-driven pump provided compressed air to drive the two gyros and to power the servo pistons which operated the controls. Additionally, more instruments, especially the altimeter, had redundancies built in to dramatically improve safety. 3 altimeters were installed, one of them being portable and highly sensitive. There were 4 compasses, 2 airspeed indicators, 2 turn and bank indicators, a pitch and azimuth indicator, and a high-frequency transmitter. The crew selected for the new aircraft were Squadron Leader O.R. Gayford and Flight Lieutenant D.G. Bett. After waiting some days for suitable weather, a proving flight of just 2,800 miles was made to Egypt to test everything out. Despite a forced landing on the return flight, with the aircraft digging its nose into a ploughed field in Essex, the reasons for which were never fully divulged, but it was probably something embarrassing enough to be suppressed, everything else went well. The actual record-attempting flight did not happen for another year, though. Poor weather and a desire to fly during a certain season, and when a full moon was present, meant that the whole thing was pushed back to February 1933. There was also a slight delay due to the death of Flight Lieutenant Bett, who passed away due to complications during an operation, and he was replaced as navigator by Flight Lieutenant G.E. Nicoletts. Now the record stood at 5,012 miles, which necessitated the lengthening of the planned route. However, everyone was still confident that the plane could do it. Much to the relief of all, it did indeed break the record. The long-range monoplane, as that is what it was becoming known as then, took off on the 6th of February at 7:15 am. The flight went reasonably well, the weather was good, the aircraft behaved, and most importantly, the instruments didn't send it into a Tunisian hillside, though the autopilot did give up partway through and the rest of the flight was completed under manual control. 57 hours and 5,341 miles later, it landed at Walvis Bay, claiming the absolute distance record for a single flight. To add to the prestige, this meant that, for a time at least, British aircraft held the records for distance, altitude, and speed all at the same time, something that was much publicised. The aircraft was flown onto Cape Town and later completed a long tour of Africa before finally returning home on the 2nd of May for an official reception. The prestige, however, was short-lived. Just 3 months later in August, a new distance record was set by the Blériot-Zapata 110, which covered 5,657 miles. The Royal Aircraft Establishment explored the possibility of upgrading the long-range monoplane to challenge this new record. In 1934, consideration was given to re-engineering the aircraft with a diesel power plant, the 600 horsepower Junkers Umo 4. Along with some further modifications to the airframe to reduce drag, it could certainly be done. However, wind tunnel tests would take at least 3 months, the rebuild would take another 12, and the total cost of the endeavour would almost exceed that of designing a brand new aircraft. Additionally, the Blériot-Zapata, which currently held the record, had a claimed air range of 7,825 miles, which still placed it ahead. Fairey suggested that if the experimental Bristol Phoenix was used, their aircraft could exceed a range of 10,000 miles, but this would of course further increase the cost of the project. In the end, the Royal Aircraft Establishment suggested in its report that the best and most economical procedure was to design and build a brand new aircraft from the ground up, and so the Fairey monoplane received no further modifications. Despite being a record-setting aircraft, and a damn unique-looking one at that, it sadly didn't live out the year, and it was scrapped at some point in late 1934. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a special thank you, of course, to the patrons, whose names you'll hopefully see here. Now, I apologise if this video was a bit rough. The video planned for today was lost thanks to a corrupt Adobe Premiere file, and I had to advance this video, which was planned for Wednesday, to this weekend, so that we didn't have a 10-day lull in content. Hopefully I can get the other video finished for next weekend, so stay tuned. A big thank you as well to the Wing Commanders, the highest tier patron supporters. You guys have seen my video plans for this month, and despite editing problems, that should remain mostly on schedule. We'll see. But anyway, thank you all so much, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.